From South Carolina Public Radio, this is the South Carolina LEDE. I'm your host, Gavin Jackson, and this episode was recorded on July 1st, 2025, from South Carolina Public Radio Studios here in Columbia. On this episode of the LEDE, I bring you my interview with PBS legend, award-winning documentarian Ken Burns, as we discuss his latest project, The American Revolution, that he co-directed with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt. The new 6-part, 12-hour series will premiere on November 16th on PBS stations around the country, including SCE-TV.
Wow.
But I had the opportunity to sit down with Ken at the College of Charleston on May 14th as part of PBS's largest outreach effort ever in the network's history. It was part of a 25-plus market tour that Burns was visiting this year and through next year as America celebrates its 250th anniversary. South Carolina played a major role in the Revolutionary War, which I talk about with Ken. Yeah, I call him Ken. But I started our interview broad by asking him about what he hopes to achieve with this new documentary.
We just want to tell a complicated story of what happened during the American Revolution. I think that our views of it have been so sanitized by the fact that it takes place in a pre-photographic era, so we don't have the proof that photographs and newsreels would represent. These are people in tights and breeches and powdered wigs, and so there's a distance from them. We're just interested in how we tell the story of the American Revolution, which is, of course, our founding story, and engages lots of political and social things as well. It's just, we want to tell a complicated story. The last thing on earth that we'd want to do is tell people what they should get out of it. History is mostly made up of the word story plus high, which is a good way to begin a story. And we'd like to leave it at that. We've spent nearly a decade trying to figure out how to tell in 6 parts and 12 hours a complicated story of our creation.
Mm-hmm. How do you do, like you were saying, you don't have as much material like you did for the Civil War, Vietnam War, all these other major documentaries you've done. What are you relying on here? Is it any different how you're doing this?
The process is actually remarkably the same. There is a tyranny to choice as much as there is a tyranny to no choice, meaning photographs. The process is different. We had to recalibrate. I've been someone that has not been interested in reenactments per se, and we don't do them in the traditional senses that we get people to reenact the Battle of Cowpens. We've just followed reenactors at every time of day and night in every season from New Hampshire and Maine to Georgia. And they're dressed in militia and Southern militia and continental uniforms, and they're German and they're French and they're British of all different stripes. And then, having said that, we collected a big body of material that would help us, along with paintings and maps and printed documents, commentary of scholars and writers, and first-person voices of hundreds of people, both well-known, George Washington and John Adams, and et cetera, and people who are much less well-known, and in fact were completely new to me.
And so when we talk about the war itself, how it started, and this origin story we're talking about of America, did it just come down to taxes? I mean, what was really the big spark here? What really got this war going in a way that changed the whole face of it?
Certainly, taxation and representation are an important dynamic. It's also Indian land. Most of the American colonists are interested in moving westward. New immigrants definitely want to do that. They want to move into, whether they're, and you understand it in a way that your family has in Wales or Ireland or Scotland or England worked the same piece of land for someone else for 1,000 years. And you have this opportunity to own your own land. The only problem is that it's the territory of dozens of Native American nations who have not in any way agreed to sell or to lease or to whatever. In some cases, the sales and the leases take place, but mostly it's outright stealing. You also have land speculators like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin who are dealing in tens of thousands of acres that they don't actually own, hoping to sell to those very immigrants. So a lot of it is the pressure. The British, when they win the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, their treasury is bankrupt. They've got the most far-flung empire on earth, and they don't have any way to defend Americans who are increasingly pouring over the Appalachians and being killed by Indians that are resisting understandably, the encroachments on their territory. So they set a line of demarcation in 1763 that says you can't go over that, which causes incredible internal strife. So if you add to taxation and representation, which is the grammar school single cause, and is a good one, if you add Indian land, then you've got a set of complex reasons. You also have the distance. And in the distance, the American colonies had sort of developed their own identity. Let me ask you a question. How were the colonists, both rich and poor, in Boston dressed when they dumped the tea in the harbor?
As Native Americans?
As Native Americans. Why were they dressed as Native Americans?
They're trying to frame them or trying to prove a point, I suppose?
So that would be what everybody says, that, you know, to try to frame them for this crime. No, they were saying, as the Phil Deloria, the scholar, says in the film, they were trying to prove that they were different from the mother country, that they were aboriginal. What would be more aboriginal and ironic than to dress as the people whose land you were in the process of dispossessing? But for the purposes of making a statement to Britain, we are these people, is a way of saying we are not you anymore. And so, obviously, the revolution begins on April 19th at Lexington Green, but is it December of 73 with the Boston Tea Party? Is it March of 70 with the Boston Massacre? Is it this event? Is it this signing? Is it this telltale? So what happens is there's a long series, a kind of 20-year run-up from the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, a global war in Europe, to what is the beginning of our revolution. And it's very, very complicated. And you can begin to see the nuances for the colonists. They're separate, they're different, they feel different, and they're beginning to take on an identity.
And then when we talk about the fighting itself and how difficult that was, I mean, one day you're neighbors, the next day you're fighting each other. I mean, was there any room to not pick a side, or what? How did it break down?
Oh, you know, we throw out numbers and percentages, and they're inaccurate because everything is very, very fluid. There are times when you could swear that South Carolina was most definitely, as everybody had been predicting, loyalist. And a few months later, not so much. And Cornwallis could complain to England that the whole province is in rebellion. So what you have are people that are most definitely loyalists or Tories, and there are people who are patriots or rebels, as they're called, or Whigs. And then there are people that are disaffected or trying to stay out of it. And they, in some cases, have the worst of it, because if you're not one or the other, then you're suspect to both, as well as to the British. And so you've got the complicated dynamics. And let us remember, this is not just our image of the militiaman, the sturdy farmer. We're talking about enslaved people, free black population, native population on the west, but also native population integrated and involved in the daily life of the colonies. It's an incredibly fluid, and the other thing is we're not talking about women. A majority of the population, they're involved at every angle in the resistance, in the opposition to the resistance, in accompanying armies on both sides. We follow a German officer's wife from Germany to the Battle of Saratoga. We follow women throughout who are patriots. It's a very, very complicated dynamic, and we have an obligation to them not to sanitize it, not to romanticize it, not to make it a kind of sentimental thing that is devoid of the violence, but also of the inspiring ideals that are at the heart of our revolution.
And this is the original anti-colonial movement we were talking about too,
well, this
right here.
is what the scholar Christopher Brown says in our film. When we think about of the last, particularly in the 20th century, all these anti-colonial movements happening in the third world, he said, we forget that we invented that, and we did invent that. We were the first, and I've been in many situations talking about this where people have sort of grilled me about anti-colonialism. I said, well, the United States is the original anti-colonial movement.
To create a government no one had ever seen before.
Well, this is the miracle of it. This is the first revolution that had proclaimed the unalienable rights of all people. However limited its writers felt, it was nevertheless a foot in the door. It was deeply, deeply meaningful to people who weren't going to be extended those rights, because you could see in it, once you've articulated something, once you've said it, it's going to happen at some point. I mean, just nobody really spoke before the revolution, as the late historian Bernard Bailyn says in our film, about slavery. But the second the Patriots began using the metaphor of slavery to define what King George and the Parliament was doing to them, then the question of slavery came up. And once you say that there's certain universal rights, that all men are created equal, you've already opened the door, and it's over. It's done. Now, unfortunately, it takes 49 years for it to be done, and then it takes an amendment and another amendment, another amendment, and there are a lot of people today that would say it's still not over. And so, we have with these aspirational documents, just that, aspirations to perfection.
I was going to say, what does the Declaration of Independence really mean in this situation, and how important was it to the Revolutionary War?
We say pursuit of happiness. The key is the word pursuit. We say a more perfect union. The key is process. That we're not ever getting there. We're looking for perfection. You're never going to achieve it, but you have to be moving towards it. And the periods of our greatest strength have been when we have moved towards it, and the greatest weakness and fragility is when we have retrenched and taken steps backwards. And so the revolution is all a lesson. The documents are all a lesson. The formation, the creation of the United States of America are all a lesson in process and submitting to the inevitable activity of process.
I have another general question before we get to the South, and this is a really general question, but how does George Washington manage to do this? I mean,
I don't know. It's pretty amazing. I mean, I've spent a long time raising money for this film and detailing all of the various characters and all the various groups that are included and how complicated it is, and it's not superficial and all of this. And someone at one point had the temerity to say, with great nervousness, as if to offend whatever sensibilities I might have, and who is emerging as the most important figure? I said, George Washington, of course. We don't have a country without him. Let's just say that. We do not have a country. The United States of America does not exist without him. Lots of other people, but he is the principal reason. He is, as Annette Gordon-Reed, the historian, says, the glue that held us together. We can't imagine what it would have been like without him. A lot of it has to do with an almost unknowable personality. He's just diffident, he's opaque, he's unreadable. It also has to do with his incredible bravery. You could even say rashness on the battlefield, riding out in the middle of moments that changed the course of the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, of riding out on the field at Princeton where aides are covering their eyes, or at Kips Bay in Manhattan where they're grabbing at the reins of the horse to pull him back. He's certain to be killed. And he makes terrible mistakes. He makes the same blunder twice with his army in Long Island, the biggest battle of the American Revolution. It's a terrible defeat. And he makes it again, the same mistake, only not the left flank, but the right flank at Brandywine. But his perseverance, his demeanor, his ability to understand the politics, his ability to inspire human beings, his ability to identify generals and subordinates that are good, his willingness more than anything else to give up power after the revolution, to resign his military commission, and then after he is unanimously elected president of the United States, to give up after 2 terms. It is just the tip of the iceberg of this, as he has been called, indispensable man, but in some ways utterly unknowable. And the voice we picked to read for him, Josh Brolin, we deliberately had a kind of opacity to the voice. As Joe Ellis, the historian, says, nobody's going to get in there. Maybe Martha gets in there, maybe Hamilton, maybe Lafayette, but nobody really gets in there. And that reserve, is a great deal of what the mystery of leadership is about. And as I said, we don't know George, know us.
Of course, attention turned to the South, right? So can you describe for us really what the South meant in the colonies at the time, and what role we played down here when it came to whether it was production or the economy, or the role it meant for the crown? So
you think of the revolution as a symphony in 3 movements. And the first movement is New England, the second is the Mid-Atlantics, and then it moves to the South. And it moves to the South for a pretty good reason. After the surrender at Saratoga, an entire British army surrendering, it brings the French in. The British are looking to, in some ways, try to figure out the best way to go on. The 2 most prosperous colonies, the profit-making colonies, are Virginia and South Carolina. They have the most enslaved people. They're dependent. They're feeding the Caribbean as well as generating a great deal of profits. And so the idea is that maybe we'll go down and consolidate there. We may not be able to save all of the other places, but to sort of hold on to these valuable properties here. They have 13 other colonies in the Caribbean that are far more profitable. And that's because they have a greater percentage, Jamaica and Barbados, upwards of 90% enslaved people. So you've got these great engines of wealth for the empire of Great Britain, and South Carolina and Virginia particularly represent that. But they're going to start in Georgia, move to South Carolina, and once they're pacified, move on to North Carolina, and then into Virginia. That's the reason. But Georgia works out pretty well for a while, and then there's a gigantic oops in South Carolina. They take the biggest prize, the biggest defeat the Americans have in the Revolution is at Charleston. We surrender an entire army. It's never happened before. It doesn't happen afterwards, and that sort of sets the stage for the British assumption that they can sort of restore South Carolina, but they do it with a military rule that then turns this place into just an unbelievable killing field of civil war.
And that was after 1776 with the Battle of Fort Moultrie.
So there's a British expedition in June of 76 that goes down and is not successful. They limp back to New York and are part of the big Battle of Long Island, which the British prevail in, and they take Manhattan and will have Manhattan until 1783. But they move down, and in May, they force the surrender of General Benjamin Lincoln. May of 1780 is when it falls. And then, be careful what you wish for, you've got South Carolina, but then it all begins to go undone. There are victories in the Washoes, there are victories at Camden, and then things turn around. A lot of it has to do with brutal military rule. A lot of it has to do with treatment by loyalists of their Patriot neighbors, and all of a sudden the pacified territory is most definitely unpacified. And 1/5 of all battlefield deaths in the entire Revolution take place in South Carolina. That's how bad it is.
And you're talking about that period after 1780 when it's really just a brutal time, but that's also when you see Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and the guerrilla warfare really coming into play.
The guerrilla warfare is most evident in a most organized way, if you can call guerrilla warfare organized, here. A little bit in New Jersey, but it is in South Carolina. Something. It's Francis Marion. It's other people who are aiding militia units and continental forces, and they're basically, in lots of cases, attacking and losing, attacking and getting away with some. There are some really notable victories at Kings Mountain, at Cowpens, but mostly it's sort of picking away at the British Army, which cannot be as easily resupplied as this burgeoning Patriot movement is. Because if you're doing the calculus, whether you're loyalist or disaffected, and you're seeing what's happening, you do not necessarily want to call attention to yourself as being a strong supporter of the king. And so things are really flipping.
I want to ask you about just the role that Hollywood plays in making this more dramatic than it is, or maybe as dramatic as it was. But when we talk about The Patriot with Mel Gibson, obviously he was a composite character, his character, and a lot of that was with Francis Marion. Do you think when we see certain wars, certain events play out in Hollywood, that it helps or hurts educating people, or do you think that just helps get people in the door to learn more, hopefully?
I think it's more of the latter. I hope it's more of the latter. There's some egregious things. The Patriot's not a favorite film of mine. It's kind of over the top, and I don't think it does a service. But if it piques somebody's interest and they want to know more, then it does something. And let us also remember that, there's a guy who used to take the histories and change characters and change countries, conflate people, and his name is William Shakespeare, and we're very happy that he takes those kinds of liberties. I'm not sure it's Ridley Scott, is that who did The Patriot? That he's in a Shakespearean level, but I think that we have to be aware that sometimes fiction is as powerful a truth as the fact. I subscribe to the fact that the facts are always much more powerful than fiction, and you can't make this stuff up.
I support that.
And the idea of sanitizing it or making it overly romantic it does a disservice to particularly the sacrifices of those people who did fight in it and were willing to risk everything for a completely untried idea, which is freedom and liberty. Before the United States, everybody was a subject. After the United States, there were a few lucky people who were citizens.
Do you think it's hard for folks to learn history, to learn the lessons of history, or are we hell-bent on doing it our own way, even if it's already been done before?
Well, human nature doesn't change, and so we are susceptible to all the things, as Shakespeare said, the flesh is heir to. And so all of the qualities of greed and generosity and virtue and venality and selfishness and selflessness are on occasion everywhere. What the study of history does is it gives you perspective and makes you understand a little bit of the sense that this unchangeable human nature superimposes itself on the seemingly random chaos of events, and we can see patterns. We can see, as Mark Twain said, rhymes. And once you've seen those patterns, once you understand the rhymes, then it gives you a kind of perspective that makes your judgments that much more wise than a person who is ignorant of the forces of history.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say to people that might be anxious about the present or the future when you have studied so many of the major topics of our country?
It's okay to be anxious about the present or the future. It's pretty anxiety producing, and we don't know what's going to happen. But I can tell you that if you understand how the United States was formed, you will not give up any of the things that we earned in that war. You will not cede to any authoritarian tendencies, wherever they may be, any inch of territory. It's just not American to do that. So there's something incredibly inspirational about it, and it gives you courage. There were really, really, really dark days in the revolution, and if Las Vegas was around, if there was a betting line, it would be zero chances on April 19th, 1775 on the Lexington Green. It was a massacre. They said disperse, and they turned around and they started to disperse, and they were shot in the back. At that moment, there's zero chance of the American success. And somehow, 6.5 years later, Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington at Yorktown, and we did it. And it's still a flabbergastingly powerful story.
Ken Burns, thank you.
Thank you.
That was legendary documentary filmmaker Ken Burns on his upcoming documentary, The American Revolution, which you'll only be able to find on PBS stations like SCE-TV this November. You can watch that interview and more on youtube.com/South Carolina ETV, because we have some excerpts of the documentary in that video. And thanks for listening to the pod, y'all. You can always show us your appreciation by leaving us a review or voicemail at 803-563-7169. And you can stay up to date with the latest news on scetv.org and southcarolinapublicradio.org. And don't forget to support your local newspapers. The South Carolina Lead is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. Our producer is A.T. Shire. Amy Crouch is our supervising producer. Sean Birch is our executive producer. Amanda Allen is our intern. This podcast is produced with support from PRX and is made possible in part by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, as well as listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. For the South Carolina Lead, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina. Happy 4th of July weekend. Come back with all your toes and fingers. Please, guys, don't blow up any part of our state.
You need those fingers to subscribe to this podcast.
If you want to subscribe to this podcast, I need you to have all your fingers and toes. A lot of hair on this wall.
I like that.
I don't know.